Yesterday I went over, the problem with Terah when he was so old. They had, these three sons and the arithmetic problems there. And the ancient ways of trying to solve that, I mentioned, but I forgot to tell you about the modern ways to try to solve that. If you go to some Bible translations, throughout the genealogies, it'll start with Adam. When Adam was so-and-so many years old, he fathered when so-and-so, all the way through. Now, in the Hebrew, it's the exact same formula for everybody from Adam all the way to Terah. Exact same wording. They solve it when they get to Terah by changing the wording to after Terah was so many years old. Now, there's at least three problems I know of with that. The number one thing is if it's after for Terah, you can't deny it could be after for everybody. And as soon as you put in after for everybody, now all of a sudden you can't add them all up. The second problem is you're translating the simple conjunction in Hebrew, a wow, which is very malleable, and you can substitute sometimes certain adverbs for it, like when, but I don't know that you can substitute after a preposition for it. I have never seen that substantiated. Thirdly, Moses knows how to say after. He uses achar or acharei, the Hebrew preposition for after, in the genealogies. If he wanted to say that, he knew how to say that. And he didn't. So, I think that's a little bit of a tendentious translation, but I've seen it in, I don't read a lot of modern languages, but I've seen it in French and German Bibles as well as English Bibles. And I think I saw it in one Italian Bible. But, it's an attempt to try to deal with it. But to me, it's a tendential attempt, because as soon as you do that, you should be honest and say, we'll do that for everybody in the genealogy, because it's the exact formula for every stage in the genealogy. Second piece of business, somebody approached me last night after the sessions and had a question, and I guess my mind was a little fogged by that point because I don't remember who and I don't remember what the question was.
It's about the image of God.
I
was interested in just your thoughts on what aspects of the image of God was lost and what has been retained.
Yeah.
The fall.
Well, our synodical catechism points to the way the image of God was lost and the fact that the original righteousness we had was lost. And in that respect, it's absolutely correct, right? So we lost that original righteousness that Adam and Eve had. So I don't have any problem with that. But, when Noah gets off the ark, right, you have this interesting passage about capital punishment. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed. For humans were made in the image of God, implying that something about the image of God is still around, lingering in us. I think certainly the capacity to do moral thinking, right? I mean, dogs don't do moral thinking. Giraffes don't do moral thinking, right? The capacity to think in moral terms. The idea of the fact that we have embedded in us a conscience that tells us right and wrong. These are things that I think are vestiges of the image of God. Now, I can't prove exactly what that is, but if you're asking me what I think these are the type of things that are vestiges of the image of God.
Going back to Genesis 1, when they talk about the image of God, like God, the two things that happen right away in his blessing is the ability to bring forth life, procreation, and dominion, ruling over other parts of the creation. And we're still doing that.
Right. And we're still doing that.
That never stopped throughout.
Right. Yeah. So, in the sense that our catechism, our synodical catechism intends it, I don't have any problem with it. We lost the original righteousness. But yeah, I think there are vestiges of it. And I think that passage later on after the flood hints at that.
Follow up on that.
Yeah.
Pierre de Chardin, Taylor de Chardin,
Yeah.
says the omega point is that for which evolution was reaching, and the image of God is somehow connected to man reaching the point of evolution where he is at the highest point, and then Christ comes, and Christ being the image of God gives us, and we who believe in him will enter into the omega point, the afterlife of Christ being everything to, as Colossians says, all in all. Somehow that fits together with that trusting of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he probably is doing more philosophy than he is Bible, though.
He argues against that point.
Yeah.
He just said it. He says, no, and most of his books had not yet been printed when he died.
Yeah.
So people are still arguing about, did he come back to what you're talking?
Right, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I'd like to progress on to another reason why I don't think you can add these genealogies up and determine when the flood was or when creation was. Positioning, I mentioned this briefly, the position of Enoch, Noah, Eber, and Abram. There are numerically significant positions. Enoch 7th, Noah 10th, Eber 14th, twice 7, Abraham 20th, twice 10. I think this indicates an editorial arrangement that purposely skipped generations. And I think you can actually calculate on whether this is random or not, because I've had, especially some evangelicals, write me and say, well, I could have just been random and could have just happened randomly that way. Well, and I'll show you how you can calculate that in a minute, but you can calculate it, and the answer is the chance of it being random are 27 10,000ths of 1%. Almost zero. Almost zero. You go, well, how can you determine that? Well, I'll show you that in a minute. But before we go there, note the genealogy of David and Ruth 4. There's 10 generations. Boaz is 7. David is 10. I don't think that's random either. Now, this genealogy probably skips over 9 or 10 generations, at least 8, if not 9 or 10 generations. You compare the priestly chronology and I'm sorry, that's 1 Chronicles 6:33 to 37. Over the same period of time, there's 18 generations. What are the chances there's only 10 in David's line? No. David's probably skips at least 8, if not 9 or 10 generations, in order to put Boaz at the strategic 7th spot and David at the strategic 10th spot. And I think the author of Ruth is doing this in imitation of Genesis. Why? Because David is the next person to get the Messianic promise. This is a Messianic genealogy, just like the genealogies in Genesis are Messianic genealogies. Most people don't even realize when they read that that's what's going on there. If there's no generation skipped in David's genealogy here, the average age of a father when his son would be born would have to be between 90 and 100 years old. That's average, which means some would be older and some would be younger, right? That's how it kind of works. But during that era, from the time of the Exodus to the time of David, that's a ridiculous number. And in my writings, I go into more detail about how ridiculous that is. There's another selective genealogy. And I think it is purposely imitating Genesis, and it's injecting a messianic note into Ruth. So if you want to find out where Ruth is messianically oriented, it's right there at the end of the book, which then gives a messianic cast to the entire book. Another reason why, I think it's kind of strange, and I mentioned this briefly, ancient Near Eastern chronology. If Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies are taken as continuous, the flood took place about 2500 BC, give or take. This would be the middle of, I said fifth, sorry, Egypt's sixth dynasty. Really impossible to have a flood in the middle of the sixth dynasty and immediately after a flood, a flourishing sixth dynasty going on. Now you can argue, well, the Egyptian chronology is wrong. Show me where. Don't just say, well, it's got to be wrong. That's an obscurantist position. But go to the other side of the ancient Near East. It'd be in the middle of the early dynastic period of Sumer. So you've got, two chronological things to deal with. Now, I'm not saying that you use extra biblical stuff to correct the Bible, but I am saying the Bible, when properly understood, meshes with extra biblical chronology. That's what I'm arguing. And just to dismiss this, now, if somebody thinks this is wrong, then I think it's incumbent on them to try to show how it's wrong, not just dismiss it. This is all based on artifactual evidence. I admire many of these creation scientists who try to show how evolution is wrong. They get into the weeds and do it. They don't just back off and say, well, it's wrong and forget about it. They actually try to show how it's wrong. It seems to me that that's what one would have to do. Get into the weeds. Now, I spent graduate school looking at this stuff, and I don't see how you can contradict it. I think the evidence is really clear. So I guess the upshot of this is we can't determine the age of the earth by using the genealogies in Genesis. We can't determine when the flood happened. Now, I believe the earth is young. I believe the flood really happened. I just don't know when. I can live with that because there's lots of things I don't know. So what's one more or two more? I think it's more of a reform position. I got to know everything. I don't have to know anything. Well, here's another reason. Before I show you how to do those calculations, here's another reason. If the genealogies are understood as continuous, Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, Ru, and Serug were alive when Abram was born. Now, that seems a little bit ridiculous on its face. Abram is born, and Shem, who survived the flood, was still around. But double it with this. Abram doubted that a man 100 years old was vigorous enough to have a son. But if Shem, Shelah, and Eber were still alive and all well over 300 years of age, why would Abraham make a statement like that? Because there were people who are still alive who had children much older than 100 years old. It doesn't comport with the facts. Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, and Eber were alive when Ishmael was born, if you take that route. And Shem, Shelah, and Eber would then be alive when Isaac was born. And later it's assumed that Isaac, an old man and near death, Esau says, I'll wait till Dad's dead. Dad's not going to live much longer. I'll wait till Dad's dead and then I'll kill my brother, right? And so this is why Jacob has to be sent off to Haran, right? And Rebekah sends him off. Well, look at here. You can calculate from the information given in Genesis that Isaac's age at this time was 136 years. If Eber was still alive, why is all of a sudden in Eber and Arpachshad, and they each lived, 400 years, why would he think 136, he's going to die soon? Now, he didn't die soon, right? I mean, Jacob goes off to Haran and lives there for 20 years and comes back, and Isaac's still alive, right? God blesses him with a long life. But he's assuming 136 years, a ripe old age, and it won't take long. And if these guys are still alive, why would he assume that? And these are his ancestors, are still alive. It creates lots of problems. Now, this was known in antiquity, and these problems were known in antiquity, and the Septuagint solved it by fiddling with the numbers. And in the Septuagint, when Abram's born, only his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father are alive. That wasn't good enough for the Samaritan Pentateuch. They fiddled with the numbers even more. So when Abram's born, only Terah's alive and all his other ancestors are dead. They knew there was a problem here. Their solution was, we're going to fiddle with the numbers in the text. But, I just don't think you can read those genealogies as continuous to father and to son in every generation. We've got warning signs as soon as we try to do that. We've got bells and whistles going off. We have sirens flashing when we get close to it. There's so many factors I've shown you that are a problem with, and you try to read those as continuous father to son and then add up the ages. And I think the answer is, I hope I showed that in the grammar, you don't have to read them that way. It's not obvious in English translation, but it's there in the Hebrew grammar itself, allows you, because the verbs are causative.
Would you say that's what sort of solves the problem of inerrancy then?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's an argument that maybe a lot of us have kind of underlying.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the fear underlying this. But it's not an error in Scripture. But, they don't argue that. I find that interesting. They don't argue that with Matthew's genealogies. He skips generations. So if it doesn't bother you with Matthew, why does it bother you? Just because there's numbers in Genesis? I don't see how the numbers change it.
It's helpful, I guess, when you explain this to your congregation, that they looked at genealogies differently back then. We look at it like data records. So it was a more intended, purpose driven, there was an intention there to display something, not just factual data driven genealogy, but to show this person important bloodlines or whatever.
Yeah, well, and I think theologically speaking, when you concentrate on these as chronology, you tend not to look at them as messianic. And the message here is messianic. God gave a promise to Eve, and he's keeping it. And he's showing how you kept it through the generations. And I think the problem with chronology is it takes your eyes off of Jesus. And you know what happens when you take your eyes off of Jesus? You fall into the Sea of Galilee. That's what happens.
You can't make that statement, though, because, and I'm not saying that that doesn't skip generations, but I also can see that it's possible that it doesn't skip generations. It specifically names, and again, I'm not saying one way or the other it has to be. Saying we need to be kind of watch this a little bit as far as where we're going with it. Just saying if you're saying it's chronological, it takes it off of Jesus. It doesn't at all. It fills in that line all the way to the Savior. And just saying, it's chronological, for me, it doesn't take it off. I see it as possible. The numbers do, because of the shortening after the flood, the very quick shortening of ages. You can see that overlap in those kids, in Shem, Ham, and Japheth, to Abraham. Okay? And so they do fit. They can fit. And yeah, there's, as far as the Egyptian dynasties, there are gaps, but there's actually a possibility, okay, that it can fit in there because there's gaps between the dynasties.
There's no real gaps. There's overlapping dynasties, but there's no gaps.
But and then the other thing that you have to look at is when you get to Saul, David, where the and the time of the judges, where we do have a really good idea of the dates. Again, like the Exodus, they only fit with a 1400.
Yeah, 1446 BC.
The Ramses idea doesn't fit.
No.
Doesn't fit with, and using the genealogies, though, that's part of how you can fit that together.
Well, you have to go from 1446 and count backwards at that point. And I don't have any trouble counting back to Abram.
But again, I'm not saying it has to be that way, chronological.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I say, I don't think we just want to just throw out the possibility either. We don't know I agree. We don't know for sure.
I mean, they're just, like I said, there are alarms and whistles going off every time you try to do it. And this has been known since antiquity, and people were fiddling with the text in antiquity to try to make it work.
Yeah, another one that, as far as you talk about the archaeological data, the pyramids is an example. I saw one. It was on a new tomb they were opening up, and it was interesting to me that when they go to open up this tomb, it's full of sand. They have to dig this thing out to get to whatever's in the tomb. How did all that sand get in there?
Well, that happens all the time in Egypt, sandstorms.
But it's inside the tomb. And it's just, yeah, well, it's still, when they're sealed up like that, it's just, again, a question. Yeah. A question that's there. One, again, the flood idea does take care of that question.
But yeah, sand gets in everywhere. Yeah, sand gets in everywhere in Egypt. Trust me. And they've been doing archaeological stuff for years, and there's always sand in everything from every era. I think these are Messianic genealogies, and the main purpose is to trace the promise from Adam to Abram. So when the narrative slows down, the Messianic promise has not been lost. I think that's what's going on there. Now, let me show you how I calculate that. We have extra time because we're a little ahead of schedule. You can disagree with this, with the assumptions, but I think it's a fairly reasonable way to do it. Let's look at this. Ah, there it goes. Well, if you're going to argue random, you got Enoch, 7th, right? Noah, 10th. I've gone over this. Yesterday, Eber is the basis for the ethnic name Hebrew. He's very important here. And Abraham and Joseph are both called Hebrews before we ever get out of Genesis. Abram's 20th. I went over this yesterday, okay? Why is 7 so important? Well, it's important throughout the Pentateuch. Not just the creation week, 7 days, sevenfold vengeance on Cain, Lamech, who brags about killing a young man, says they'll be avenged 77 times. Noah took 7 of each unclean animal or clean animal on the ark. Now, he's to take more than 2 because he's going to sacrifice some. But why 7? Why not 8? Why not 9? Why not 6? 7. That's what he's told to do. Jacob serves 7 years to pay the bride price for each of Laban's daughters, 14 total. There's 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine to show God's control over his creation that started with 7 days. 7 keeps on popping up. Passover is on double 7, 14th day of the month. Okay, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is 7 days following Passover. Tabernacle's menorah has 7 branches. The blood of the bull of the sin offering sprinkled 7 times before God. The Day of Atonement is the 10th day of the 7th month. And the sabbatical year is every 7th year, and the Jubilee is every 7 sabbatical years. Okay? Following the Day of Atonement, there's 7 days of special offerings, and each day it includes among the offerings 14 male lambs for each day. I mean, notice how this keeps on piling up. 7's just an important number. Then 10. 10 times God said, or Yomer Elohim, 10 times in Genesis 1. Of course, the tithe is based on the number 10. Jacob very rhetorically complains that Laban changed his wages 10 times. Now, you can look about Laban changing it. It's not mentioned 10 times there. I think that's just a rhetorical thing, right? You change my wages 10 times. The Passover lamb you set aside on the 10th day. The tabernacle had 10 curtains, 10 posts, 10 bases. God's covenant with Israel, you know this, is in 10 words. We call them the 10 commandments. It doesn't actually use the word for commandment. 10 words or 10 sayings, right? By the way, it never tells you. You can read the text all you want. It never enumerates the 10. It just says there were 10 things God said from Mount Sinai. Next time you get your Concordia Theological Quarterly, should be out soon, October issue. I got an article in there about the 10 commandments. So, but 10, the Day of Atonement's on the 10th day of the 7th month. God denied entry into the promised land by saying Israel had tested him 10 times by not obeying. Now, you can look at the times. I don't think it adds up to 10. I think that's another rhetorical thing. But notice how those numbers are significant. There's very few numbers that are that significant in the Pentateuch. Okay, and 7 and 10, extremely significant numbers. So let's assume that the genealogies, if it's random, they could be any length. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it's not going to be more than 20 that we have. Okay. There's no reason, if it's random, that they have to be the same length, 10 and 10. If it's random, they could be anything, 2 and 18, 5 and 15, if it's random. You should expect the last person to be prominent because wherever you end, the narrative is going to be about him, right? So the first genealogy in Genesis 5 ends with Noah, narrative's about him, Noah and his sons. Okay, the next genealogy ends at Abram and his brothers. The narrative's about Abram. So you can figure that the last person, wherever he lands, is probably going to be prominent. The genealogy could be as short as 2 persons, X, father, Y, right? So you could have a 2-person genealogy and an 18-person genealogy, for instance, if it's random, okay? The first genealogy, then, could be as short as 2 or as long as 18. So the chances of a person being in the 10th position are 1 out of 17. Can't be in the first position. If there's only 1, it's not a genealogy. So 1 out of 17, or 5.9%. If the first genealogy was 10 persons long, the chances of a second person, on being 10 persons long, or 1 out of 9. Okay. So now that's 11.1%. So the combined probability of both genealogies have prominent people at the 10th position are 0.059 times 0.111, or 65 hundredths of 1%. Not good already. You already have prominent persons at 1, 10, 11, and 20, so that leaves 16 other positions for 2 other prominent people. Chances for a prominent person at position 7 are 1 out of 16. So that's probability of 6.3%. Chances for another prominent person are at position 14 are 1 out of the 15 that are left. So that's 6.67%. So the combined probability for positions 7, 10, 14, and 20 is the product of all those, is that 27 hundredths of 1%. The probability the arrangement is purposeful is 1 minus that, or well over 99%. So I would argue that these guys there are at prominent positions because Moses put them there by skipping generations to get them there.
How do we have gotten it?
Well, as soon as we start bringing God in, then you're not arguing random, right?
Well, right. Exactly. I think your point was that there were a number of editorial or rhetorical rather uses of 7 and 10, but the vast majority of those, almost all of them, are because God had commanded these.
Right.
And it seems that if God's going to use 7 and 10 that much, he might also be intentional on how he, plugs these people into the genealogies in a sort of natural way.
Yeah.
Naturally, 7 because God commanded that way.
Right. Right. Agreed. Okay, but as soon as you bring that into it, then there's no argument. I mean, I can't argue for it or against it because I don't know that God did that or whether God inspired Moses to do that. Right? I'm just saying if Moses did it, if it's authorial, human authorial, it's not random. Okay? If it's something Moses consciously did, it's not random. Or, well, it could be random, but if it's random, go buy a lottery ticket. But yeah, if God did it, right, that's fine. But I have no way of knowing God did it. God doesn't say at this point, I did it that way. Right.
Okay, so because of all of the evidence that you showed us of where people are going to land and stuff like that, and with these intentional placings that you're arguing then that there is the skipping generation. That's what all this points to.
Right.
Moses skipping generations
to get these guys at the right spot. Yeah. Yeah. I just think there's a lot of alarm signals that go off when you try to use these to add up and find the age of the earth or the date of the flood. And it's been there since antiquity. It's been recognized since antiquity. And I think just leave it alone. It's not there. It's not primarily there for chronology. I'm not arguing that these guys didn't live that long. I believe they lived that long. I'm not arguing that it didn't happen. I believe it happened. I am arguing that the scriptures don't record everything that happened. Not even in the life of Abraham, who's got more in Genesis than any other person.
So you demonstrated kind of like what this should be used for, but it is inspired, right? So and all scripture is profitable for teaching. So what would you say the application of the numbers is? Like, why are the numbers there?
The numbers there are showing us God's commitment and blessing to the people he used to bring about his ultimate goal of bringing the Messiah. God blesses them. The people who live long lives in the Bible, for the most part, I mean, extraordinarily long lives in the Bible, are people that God blesses. I mean, outside the Messianic line, Joseph, right? God blesses him. He lives a long life. Moses, God blesses him, and he lives a long life, 120 years, way outstripping with the normal lifespan in his day. I mean, Moses tells us in the psalm he wrote, you know.
So just there to show the longness of life.
Yeah, I think they're there to show us God's blessings on these people he chose. That's what I think they're there for.
Mentioned yesterday when you were talking about Matthew's genealogy, the 14, 14, 14 was there to help them memorize.
Yeah.
As a mnemonic device to help remember. And given the importance of 7 and 10 in that culture at that time, through other revelations of God they'd already received, that having important people at 7 and 10 or multiples of it is, again, a way to remember, because they don't have it in front of them. They don't have the story that they can read like we can over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, even in later antiquity, in Jesus' day, most people don't own their own Bible. You've got to go to the synagogue and hear it read to you, right? So some of these things serving as mnemonic devices are important. Yeah.
Could you go back to your earlier question they proposed, why did Abraham feel like he was full to father a child at age 100?
Because he's outlived almost everybody in his generation. I mean, even today, if you live to be 100 years old, so Abram's around in the 19th century BC. It was not unknown. I mean, most people probably died before they reached 50. But it was not unknown for people to reach 60 or 70, and maybe if they were really blessed, 80. Nonagenarians were really rare. Somebody reaching 100 would have been super rare.
But like compared to his relatives who were 300.
Yeah.
So why would he
think that if they're still alive? Why would he think that if they're still alive? I really think they're dead by then, that there's gaps there. Yeah, you have a decreasing age. I won't argue that. The numbers decrease, but it looks quickly, but is it really quickly? If there's generations skipped, how quick really was it? There's a difference between what it appears to be and what it actually is at times,
Could also another factor be that these names are sort of given to us because, like, Noah is a preacher of righteousness. And, and Luther, I think, talks about how Adam, proclaimed Christ to his children. And so, I mean, these are the ones who stood out as exemplary proclaimers of Christ.
Yeah, perhaps. Although Terah, probably has some problems. Our fathers across the river worship, right? But, even Jacob, right? When he comes back to the Holy Land, has to say to his family, get rid of your teraphim. These guys had skeletons in their closets too. Teraphim, your household idols. Yeah. Good grief, if they got to be perfect to be in the Messianic line, we're all in trouble.
Is it possible that Abraham was literally not being able to have children at 90 years old, 100 years old, because he's not had any children yet?
Possible, but I don't think that's what he's arguing. He's arguing that, I'm just worn out and old, because he adds, and Sarah is 90. So, right. So he's arguing, I'm 100, I'm too not vigorous enough, and Sarah's well beyond her childbearing years. So he's coupling the two together.
And Sarah, when she laughs, says, after I am old and my Lord is used up.
Used up. Yes, he's used up. That's what they're arguing.